Rick Grimes' most arguably famous quote is, "My mercy prevails over my wrath." But if you encountered an officer not so friendly in seasons 3 to 6, you would likely become a killing machine designed to survive the post-apocalyptic world of The Walking Dead before meeting your demise. Throughout the 11 seasons of this show, Rick Grimes would leave a stain on major characters within the franchise and would essentially be the sole reason they turned out the way they did. These people went from soft, innocent individuals to strong, leading, and intelligent survivors of the apocalypse. You can argue that Rick might have done this unintentionally due to his natural survival instincts, but his legacy carried on and echoed throughout the show long after his departure in season 9. Of course, these characters are not the brute machines they are only because of him, but he is definitely considered the catalyst for their journey as people till this day. But the exact moment these characters turned into something far more scary than a walker is actually really more odd and strange than you'd think. In today's video, we will be looking at the immense impact Sergeant Major Rick Grimes has had on beloved Walking Dead characters and how his essence continues to chime through them. At the start of the apocalypse, Rick Grimes looked like your regular sheriff, confused and scared about the dead world that surrounds him. However, looking back at the very introduction of this character allows us to understand just how much his leadership and confidence would enable him to take control of an already made group when he was in fact just one person. Although he doesn't necessarily turn people into post-apocalyptic Terminators in season 1, he does begin to ever so slightly shift the minds of hardheads like Daryl. Now, when it comes to this character, who some consider to be their favorite alongside Rick, we start to see him really change into a more caring but threatening person towards the middle to end of season 2. And then he essentially becomes Rick's right-hand man in between seasons 3 to 4. Daryl is a very interesting case of the Rick Grimes effect because in retrospect, he really was an egotistical and even at times outrageous redneck who on the surface may have been deemed as an antagonist. But Rick slowly but surely turned Daryl into a good person by leading as the example of what you should and shouldn't be doing during the zombie apocalypse. His impact in regard to Daryl would go on for seasons upon seasons and would most notably shine when Rick Grimes supposedly had died on the bridge in season 9. Daryl, not knowing if he was truly dead, still continued to search for proof, even anything that would remotely give him closure for years on end, which goes to show the brotherhood these two had developed. Although Daryl's leadership isn't at the strength of Rick Grimes, it's evident that Daryl can lead with precision and can hold his own against many. But by far, one of the most significant transformations is none other than his own son, Carl. When we first meet Carl in season 1, he's like any regular kid. Innocent, kind, and reasonably so scared of the world around him. He stays this way throughout season 1 and 2, but a shift begins to occur from seasons 3 to 4 as our protagonist Rick starts entering the beginning of his prime. Carl quickly begins to follow in the footsteps of his father and is forced to become more brutal and less innocent because of the cruel world that threatens his survival and the ones he loves around him. Although Rick isn't necessarily in his Terminus era, he begins to take on the role of a determined leader, which was marked by his Ricktatorship speech at the end of season 2.
This isn't a democracy anymore.
This inspired Carl to take after his father as he began experimenting with weapons like pistols and such. We even see a glimpse of Carl starting to become more violent than he's supposed to when he kills one of the governor's goons without a single ounce of care. But his transformation really starts to peak around season 6 when Rick struggles to take control of Alexandria due to the cowardice minds of the citizens. He's forced to stay close to his dad, and by doing so, he learns more than a thing or two about asserting dominance and fending for yourself against those who put you in danger of death. Of course, Carl's personality by the end of his demise was earned somewhat from the struggles he had to go through, like getting shot in the eye. But the way he went out, in my opinion, perfectly depicted the impact Rick had on him in regard to caring more for the people around you than yourself. The scene I'm referring to is him sacrificing himself for Sadiq in a heartbeat, even though he was a complete stranger. However, one person that was the complete opposite of Carl's kind and caring personality was Shane Walsh, who is the precise example of what happens when you go against Rick instead of being inspired by his grace. And I have my good friend Theo Hunt here to explain it.
Hey guys, it's Theo here from the YouTube channel Theo Hunt. As the world starts to collapse and Rick lay in his coma, Shane quickly steps up into a leadership role amongst the Atlanta camp and starts to get, well, rather close to Lori and Carl, let's say. And for a time period, Shane thrives in this new world, as we see that he has a mindset well suited for the apocalypse. As well as this, he falls deeply in love with the idea of becoming a father to Carl and being with Lori. However, when Rick miraculously returns from the hospital, we see a total shift in dynamics at the camp. Rick now not only displaces Shane as the sole leader of the group, but also takes back his family. Rick's mere presence strips Shane of his newfound purpose in life, which in turn sparks a deep identity crisis within the man. Shane is lost without Lori and Carl, and he really struggles to not just accept his new role in the group, but also to accept losing Lori and Carl to Rick. And as we go further into the apocalypse, Shane and Rick start to clash on ideologies, on how to survive and how to lead the group. And this really starts to wear down Shane, and he starts to see Rick not as a friend or even a rival, but as an obstacle that is just merely standing in his way. This paranoia isn't just about jealousy, it's about obsession, and it eventually turns deadly. Look, we all know the story. Shane lures Rick out, they have an intense counter on the hillside, and Rick is eventually forced to take his best friend's life in self-defense. Now, this moment changes Rick forever, as we see through the constant hallucinations of Shane throughout the later season. But this moment showed us all that Rick had exactly what it takes to lead. Rick broke Shane physically, as we all saw him kill him. However, Rick also broke Shane mentally, even if it was unintentional. In the end, Rick didn't just threaten Shane's place in the group, he forced Shane to confront the parts of himself he could no longer control. And that ultimately led to Shane's death, giving an insight into the leader Rick would go on to become as he adopts many of Shane's ideologies. But that night on the farm was not only the death of Shane, but also Officer Friendly.
Now, unlike Shane who went against Rick, Glenn is a perfect example of what happens when you are surrounded by Rick Grimes' aura and his ability to thrive in a world run by the undead. We were first introduced to Glenn at the very end of the pilot episode when he actually saves Rick from a herd of walkers. This established the innocent side to Glenn we know and love that is defined by his caring characteristics and his ability to put the needs of others ahead of his own. However, as we move on to later seasons, we see a side of Glenn we didn't really see much of before. One that shows mercy, but also dominance when needed. A prime example of this is in season 6. When his skills as a survivor begins to be questioned by the weak-minded individuals of the Alexandria group. He brushes it off because he knows he has what it takes to scavenge and fight and thus doesn't need to prove it to anyone and certainly not himself. But when one of the guys takes a swing at him, we see just how much he's learned to quickly dodge and hit, similar to Rick Grimes' ability to fight. More importantly, he turns from this almost teenager-looking person who is immature to someone who has the ability to teach, lead, and even make precise decisions to allow for the survival of the main group. This hits even harder considering he was going to be a father, and I'm pretty sure we would have seen many characteristics Rick held in raising Carl being implemented in Herschel over the years. Although it can be argued the true turning point of Glenn's innocence was during season 6 when he killed for the first time, I feel like it would be wrong to say Rick hadn't been the one who led him up to that decision at the end of the day. Even during season 5, when we were watching the prime of Rick, we could see him turning other members of the group into something different, far more able to fend in this chaotic world, and one of those people was definitely Rhee. However, someone with an even more drastic change throughout the seasons that still thrives in his spirit in present day is Carol, another core member of the original group who was introduced at the dawn of the series, and almost appeared to be a side character at the start that would slowly fiddle out. But her transformation is one that was completely unexpected, and Rick definitely had something to do with it. Before and during the start of the apocalypse, Carol was abused by her husband, and after he passed, she still embodied someone who was kind and caring but felt like a victim. However, this would all change during seasons 3 to 4 when we got our first glimpse to a side of Carol we had not thought possible. Although the start of her transformation was met with a few roadblocks as Rick forced her to leave, her grand return in season 5 solidified her as a key member of the group and someone who was inspired by Rick Grimes' smart and precise ideas in dire times. She ended up essentially saving the whole group due to her clever thinking by causing explosions inside the terminus. And as we moved on to season 6, it's evident she had turned into a killing machine when she bravely disguised herself as a wolf to stealthily take them out one by one. This is something that highly resembles Rick's courage and ability to kill for his family, and we still see it running through her veins in current day Walking Dead with Rick gone and her being in France with Daryl. She thinks quick and innovates, with the ability to sense when someone is lying or that something just isn't right. But unlike Carol, who started off as this innocent person who couldn't hurt a fly, Negan's introduction was completely opposite and, in fact, villainous. As most of you probably know, Negan is one of the most memorable antagonists in all of The Walking Dead, but if you thought Rick didn't have anything to do with it, you would be completely wrong. Although from season 7 to 8 during the Savior War, Negan was quite stubborn and unable to change, we would get to see the biggest downfall and then uprise in Walking Dead history. As the war progressed all the way until the end of season 8, we got the closest look we could have at Rick's mercy prevailing over his wrath, when he decided to spare Negan's life at the end when he had every right to kill him. However, this would allow for him to be fleshed out as the most redeemed character in the entire franchise, which allowed him to be a favorite amongst many. It can be argued that this wasn't because of Rick due to his departure towards the beginning of season 9, but him sparing Negan was more than it may have seemed. On top of putting Negan in a prison cell, it allowed him to reflect on his life and his poor choices, which would enable him to turn into a completely different person, even saving Rick's daughter during a winter snowstorm. Unlike Shane, who was too far gone, Rick's mercy allowed Negan to have a new and better life, and it's evident that he now carries himself with courage and care thanks to the man who prompted his redemption. Now, I know that Rick Grimes has impacted many more characters than just the ones I mentioned, but I think the people covered are the most significant transformations to have occurred throughout The Walking Dead by the grace of Officer Friendly. And I know what you're probably thinking, where's characters like Herschel and Morgan? Well, the truth is that these characters changed mostly on their own, and it can be argued that if anything, they were the ones to change Rick at the end of the day. If you enjoyed this video and would like early access, ad-free content, please go check out my Patreon to see if anything interests you, as it helps a ton. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and as always, leave a comment down below describing what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.